Brutal bikers harass a lone traveler. When his identity is revealed, they beg for forgiveness. The scorching sun blazed down on the vast, empty desert highway, stretching endlessly into the horizon. The sound of an engine hummed faintly in the distance, its steady rhythm breaking the stillness of the arid landscape. A lone traveler drove a weathered pickup truck, its paint peeling from years of wear and tear. Dust swirled in his wake as he navigated the barren stretch of road, the solitude of the desert matching his stoic demeanor. Inside the truck, the man, quiet and unassuming, gripped the steering wheel tightly. He was in his mid-30s, dressed in a plain blue shirt and a beige jacket that had seen better days. His rugged face carried the kind of wear that spoke of a life lived with equal parts hardship and resilience. A duffel bag sat on the passenger seat, its contents hidden but its presence hinting at the traveler's transient lifestyle. The man, who went by the name Daniel Cole, glanced at the rearview mirror. His piercing blue eyes scanned the empty road behind him. Satisfied there was no one following, he allowed himself a brief moment of calm. Daniel wasn't a man who sought attention or trouble, but trouble, it seemed, often found him. His past was shrouded in secrets, the kind that he worked hard to keep buried. As Daniel continued his journey, the sound of roaring engines began to echo faintly in the distance. At first, it was barely noticeable, blending into the hum of his own truck. But as the minutes passed, the noise grew louder, more distinct. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, and this time his eyes narrowed. On the horizon, a cloud of dust rose, accompanied by the unmistakable silhouette of motorcycles. There were at least a dozen of them, their riders clad in leather jackets and helmets that gleamed under the harsh sunlight. The bikers rode in a tight formation, their movements calculated and deliberate. They weren't just passing through, they were hunting. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the bikers closed the distance. He had dealt with men like this before, groups who thrived on intimidation and chaos. He had no interest in a confrontation, but he also knew that avoiding one might not be an option. The lead biker, a burly man with a thick beard and a menacing presence, signaled to the others. The group began to spread out, their engines roaring louder as they surrounded Daniel's truck. The sound was deafening, a symphony of aggression meant to unsettle their prey. Daniel kept his expression neutral, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He eased off the accelerator slightly, letting the bikers catch up. One of them pulled alongside his window, slapping the side of the truck with a gloved hand. "Hey, buddy," the biker shouted over the noise. "You lost or something? This here's our road." Daniel didn't respond. He kept his focus on the road, his demeanor calm but alert. The biker didn't take kindly to being ignored. He revved his engine, pulling ahead before cutting sharply in front of the truck, forcing Daniel to slow down. Another biker moved alongside the passenger side, his helmeted face turning to peer into the truck. "What's in the bag, traveler? You carrying something worth sharing?" Still, Daniel remained silent. His lack of reaction only seemed to fuel their aggression. The lead biker signaled again, and the group began to corral the truck, forcing Daniel to pull over onto the side of the road. The moment the truck came to a stop, the bikers dismounted, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel. They formed a loose circle around the vehicle, their postures radiating hostility. The leader approached the driver's side window, his hands resting on his hips. "Step out of the truck," he ordered, his voice low and threatening. "Let's have ourselves a little chat." For a moment, Daniel considered his options. He could drive off, but they'd likely chase him down. He could comply, but that would mean putting himself at their mercy. Neither option was particularly appealing, but Daniel knew he had to tread carefully. These men thrived on power and intimidation, and any sign of weakness would only embolden them. Slowly, Daniel pushed open the door and stepped out. He stood tall, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. The bikers exchanged glances, their leader sizing him up. Well, the leader said, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "You don't look like much, do you?" Daniel didn't take the bait. He stood silently, his gaze steady as he assessed the situation. The leader took a step closer, invading his personal space. "Got a name, traveler?" the man asked. "Daniel," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "Well, Daniel," the leader said, his smirk widening. You're on our turf now. And there's a toll for passing through. Daniel tilted his head slightly. I didn't see any signs. The bikers chuckled, their laughter low and menacing. The leader's smirk turned into a scowl. Funny guy, huh? Let me spell it out for you. Empty your pockets, hand over the bag, and maybe we'll let you walk away. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. I don't want any trouble, he said evenly. But I'm not giving you anything. The laughter stopped. The air grew tense as the bikers closed in, their leader's face darkening with anger. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said. But guts won't save you out here. The leader reached for Daniel's duffel bag, but before he could grab it, Daniel's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. The sudden movement caught the bikers off guard, their bravado faltering as they realized this wasn't an ordinary traveler. Don't touch the bag, Daniel said, his voice low and commanding. The leader yanked his hand back, glaring at Daniel. You just made a big mistake, pal. Before the situation could escalate further, one of the bikers stepped forward, holding a phone. Boss, he said, his voice uneasy. You need to see this. The leader snatched the phone, his eyes narrowing as he read the screen. His expression shifted from anger to confusion, then to something resembling fear. He looked up at Daniel, his bravado suddenly replaced with uncertainty. Is this you? He asked, holding up the phone. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The recognition in the leader's eyes said it all. The bikers began murmuring among themselves, their hostility giving way to unease. The leader hesitated, then took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. Look, we didn't know who you were, he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. No hard feelings, right? Daniel's gaze swept over the group, his expression unreadable. The bikers, once so confident and threatening, now looked like schoolboys caught in the act. The shift in power was palpable, and for the first time, the group seemed to understand just how out of their depth they were. The bikers stood in a tense semicircle around Daniel, their bravado now replaced with a mix of unease and curiosity. The leader held the phone tightly in his hand, his eyes darting between Daniel and the screen. His face betrayed a combination of recognition and disbelief. I asked you a question, Daniel said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. What's on that phone? The leader stammered, his earlier confidence completely shattered. It's just something I came across online. He stopped himself, as if saying it aloud would confirm the impossible. Daniel held out his hand. Let me see it. The leader hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly handed over the phone. Daniel's eyes flicked to the screen, scanning the article that had sent the bikers into disarray. The headline was bold and clear, Ex-Special Forces Commander Daniel Cole, the ghost who walks. Beneath the headline was a photo of Daniel, dressed in tactical gear and standing among a group of soldiers. The caption detailed his military accolades, missions he had led, and his reputation as a man who could turn the tide of any conflict. It also mentioned his mysterious disappearance from the public eye after leaving the service. Daniel sighed inwardly. He had worked hard to leave that part of his life behind, but it seemed the world wasn't ready to let him go. The leader swallowed hard. We didn't know, man. If we'd known it was you wouldn't have stopped me, Daniel finished, his tone icy. The group shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance now replaced with an almost childlike fear. They had underestimated the quiet man in the old truck, and now they were scrambling to make amends. The leader took a cautious step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. Look, Mr. Cole, we didn't mean any harm. Honest. It's just, we didn't realize who we were dealing with. Daniel's eyes narrowed. And that makes it okay? Intimidating people, stealing from them, this is how you spend your time? The leader looked down, unable to meet Daniel's gaze. It's just how we survive out here. The world's tough, you know? Daniel let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. You think this is tough? You have no idea what tough is. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. Daniel took a step closer to the leader, his presence commanding and unrelenting. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Rick," the leader replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, Rick," Daniel said. "Here's how this is going to go. You're going to gather your crew, get on your bikes, and ride out of here. And you're going to think long and hard about the choices you've been making." Rick nodded quickly. "Got it. We'll leave right now." But Daniel wasn't finished. He stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "And if I ever hear about you pulling something like this again, if I ever catch wind of you threatening people who can't fight back, I'll find you. And trust me, you don't want that." Rick's face went pale, and he nodded again, more vigorously this time. "Understood. Absolutely. We'll stop. No more of this." Daniel stepped back, his piercing gaze sweeping over the rest of the group. "That goes for all of you. Don't think I won't remember your faces." The bikers mumbled their agreements, their heads bowed like scolded children. One by one, they mounted their motorcycles, their earlier swagger completely erased. The engines roared to life, but the sound lacked the aggression it had carried before. Within moments, they were gone, disappearing into the horizon in a cloud of dust. Daniel watched them go, his expression unreadable. He waited until the sound of the engines had faded completely before turning back to his truck. He climbed in, started the engine, and continued down the highway as if nothing had happened. But the encounter lingered in his mind. It wasn't the first time his past had caught up to him, and he doubted it would be the last. Despite his best efforts to live a quiet life, the shadow of his former identity seemed determined to follow him. Hours later, Daniel pulled into a small roadside diner, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the conversations were quiet. He parked his truck and stepped inside, the scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee greeting him like an old friend. The diner was nearly empty, save for a waitress behind the counter and an elderly couple sitting by the window. Daniel took a seat at the counter, nodding politely at the waitress as she approached. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone friendly but tired. "Coffee," Daniel replied. "Black?" She nodded and poured him a steaming cup, placing it in front of him with a small smile. "Long day?" "You could say that," Daniel said, taking a sip. As he sat there, staring into the dark liquid, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." Daniel looked up to see a young man standing beside him, holding a notepad. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting as he shifted from one foot to the other. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked, his tone neutral. "I couldn't help but overhear, are you Daniel Cole?" Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's asking?" The young man flushed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. My name's Kevin. I'm a journalist. I've been working on a story about you." Daniel sighed. "I'm not interested." "Please," Kevin said quickly. "I just want to hear your side of things. Everyone knows about your military career, but no one knows what you've been doing since. Why you disappeared?" Daniel shook his head. "There's nothing to tell." "But there is," Kevin pressed. "People need to hear your story. They need to know what you've been through, what you've done." Daniel set his coffee down, fixing Kevin with a steady gaze. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just a man trying to live his life." Kevin opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Daniel stood up and dropped a few bills on the counter. "Thanks for the coffee," he said to the waitress, then turned and walked out. As Daniel drove away from the diner, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. He had spent years trying to leave his past behind, but encounters like these made it clear that the world wasn't willing to let him go so easily. Part of him wondered if it was time to stop running, to confront the weight of his history head-on. But for now, all he wanted was peace. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Daniel continued down the highway, the horizon stretching endlessly before him. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Daniel Cole wasn't a man to be underestimated. And while he might not see himself as a hero, those who crossed his path knew otherwise. Because sometimes, the quietest man in the room is the one with the most to say. As the horizon shifted from the warm hues of sunset to the cool, creeping darkness of night, Daniel continued driving. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the hum of his truck's engine the only sound accompanying him. Despite the calm exterior of his journey, his mind churned with thoughts, fragments of the day, of the bikers, and of the young journalist at the diner. It wasn't just the journalist's questions that had unsettled him. It was the truth in them. Daniel had spent years trying to blend into the background, to erase the larger-than-life shadow of his past. But no matter how far he drove, how quiet he stayed, or how unassuming he tried to be, the world seemed intent on reminding him of who he used to be. And then there was the guilt, a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of his conscience. For all the missions he had led and lives he had saved, there were still those he couldn't. Memories of faces, names, and places haunted him, a kaleidoscope of pain that no amount of solitude could erase. The empty road stretched on, but Daniel knew he wouldn't find peace at its end. Not tonight. A few hours later, he spotted a dimly lit motel sign flickering in the distance. It was the kind of place where travelers stopped only when they had no other options. Cheap, anonymous, and just enough to get you through the night. Daniel pulled into the gravel parking lot, the crunch of his tires breaking the stillness. He stepped out of the truck, grabbing his duffel bag from the passenger seat. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and asphalt. As he walked toward the front office, he noticed an old man sitting on a weathered bench outside, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Passing through?" the man asked, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. Daniel nodded. "Something like that?" The old man chuckled, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Aren't we all?" Inside the front office, Daniel paid cash for a room, no questions asked, just the way he preferred. The clerk handed him a key, and he made his way to his room at the far end of the lot. It was small and unremarkable, with peeling wallpaper and a bed that creaked under the slightest weight. But it was quiet, and that was all that mattered. He set his duffel bag down on the bed, sitting beside it with a heavy sigh. For a moment, he considered pulling out his phone, checking for news or messages, but he decided against it. The world could wait. Instead, he leaned back against the headboard, his eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. The encounter with the bikers replayed in his mind, their hostility, their fear when they realized who he was. And then, unbidden, came the memory of Rick's words, "The world's tough, you know?" It was true. The world was tough. But Daniel had learned long ago that toughness alone wasn't enough to justify cruelty. He had seen it too many times. Men who wielded their toughness like a weapon, leaving destruction in their wake. And while Daniel didn't consider himself a savior, he couldn't stand by and let that kind of behavior go unchecked. As sleep finally overtook him, Daniel's dreams were a mix of past and present, blurred and distorted. He saw faces he hadn't thought about in years, comrades, enemies, and civilians caught in the crossfire of conflicts he had fought to resolve. He woke several times throughout the night, each time feeling as though the weight of his memories was pressing down on his chest. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Daniel was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his duffel bag packed. He didn't like to linger in one place for too long. It made him feel exposed, vulnerable. He checked out of the motel without fanfare, leaving the quiet parking lot behind as he merged back onto the highway. A few hours later, Daniel stopped at a small gas station to fill up his tank. The station was quiet, with only a couple of cars parked outside. As he pumped gas, he noticed a man approaching him, a tall, wiry figure with a nervous energy about him. The man was dressed in worn jeans and a faded jacket, his hands fidgeting as he got closer. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice shaky. "You're Daniel Cole, right?" Daniel froze for a split second before turning to face the man, his expression guarded. "Who's asking?" I'm not here to cause trouble," the man stammered, raising his hands defensively. I heard about what happened yesterday. With the bikers." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about that?" "It's all over social media," the man said, pulling out his phone. He held it out to Daniel, showing him a video that had been posted online. The footage, taken from a distance, showed Daniel confronting the bikers. Though the audio was muffled, it was clear enough to convey what had happened. "Someone must have been passing by," the man continued. "Caught the whole thing on camera." Daniel frowned, his jaw tightening as he watched the video. He had always prided himself on staying under the radar, but this changed everything. If the video was already circulating online, it wouldn't be long before more people recognized him. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man added, his voice earnest. "Those guys have been terrorizing people around here for years. No one's ever stood up to them like that." Daniel handed the phone back, his expression unreadable. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know," the man said quickly. "But you made a difference. People are talking about it, about you. Maybe it's time you told your story." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not interested." The man nodded, stepping back. "Fair enough. But for what it's worth, you've got a lot of people on your side." As the man walked away, Daniel couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. He hadn't set out to be a symbol or a hero. He had simply done what he believed was right. But now, it seemed, his actions had taken on a life of their own. By the time Daniel reached the next town, his mind was made up. He found a small diner on the edge of town and parked his truck outside. Inside, he took a seat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee. As he waited, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through the news. Sure enough, the video of the biker encounter had gone viral. Headlines ranged from sensationalist to reverent, with phrases like mystery hero and modern-day cowboy being thrown around. Daniel sighed, setting the phone down as the waitress placed his coffee in front of him. "You okay, hon?" she asked, noticing his furrowed brow. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "Just thinking." The waitress smiled kindly. "Well, whatever's on your mind, I hope it works out for you." As she walked away, Daniel took a sip of his coffee, his thoughts racing. He had spent years trying to escape the spotlight, but now it seemed the world was determined to pull him back into it. And while part of him wanted to fight against it, another part couldn't ignore the impact his actions were having. Maybe it wasn't about the attention. Maybe it was about the people. People like the man at the gas station, who had found hope in Daniel's actions. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for Daniel Cole to step out of the shadows and embrace the role he had been avoiding for so long. Daniel sat in the diner, his coffee growing cold as his thoughts churned. He had always valued his anonymity. It was his shield, his escape. Yet now, through circumstances beyond his control, his past and present had collided in the most public way imaginable. The viral video wasn't just a fleeting moment of attention, it was a crack in the carefully constructed wall he had built around his life. But what was worse, Daniel knew, was that the attention wouldn't stop with him. Those bikers, the men he had confronted on that desert road, weren't the kind to let humiliation slide. If they were smart, they'd stay down and out of sight. But if they were foolish, well, Daniel had seen what foolish men were capable of when their pride was wounded. The small bell over the diner door jingled as someone entered. Daniel glanced up briefly and froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure he recognized all too well. A tall, burly man with a thick beard and a leather jacket. It was Rick, the leader of the biker gang. Daniel's fingers tightened around the handle of his coffee mug, his body tensing instinctively. Rick scanned the diner, his eyes landing on Daniel almost immediately. For a brief moment, the two men locked eyes. Then, to Daniel's surprise, Rick raised his hands in a gesture of surrender and walked toward him slowly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Rick said, his voice low and cautious as he approached Daniel's booth. "Can I sit?" Daniel hesitated, studying the man carefully. He didn't detect any immediate signs of hostility, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. After a moment, he gave a small nod, gesturing to the seat across from him. Rick sat down, his large frame seeming to shrink slightly under Daniel's intense gaze. He took a deep breath, then spoke. "I saw the video," Rick began. "I'm guessing you did too." Daniel said nothing, waiting for the man to get to his point. Rick shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I'm not proud of what we did out there. We were out of line. And after what you did, what you said, it got me thinking. Maybe it's time I reevaluated some things." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "You expect me to believe you had some kind of epiphany?" Rick shook his head. "I don't expect you to believe anything. But I'm here because I need your help." At that, Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression hardening. "Help? You've got a lot of nerve asking me for that. Rick sighed, running a hand through his beard. I deserve that. But this isn't about me. It's about the others. Daniel frowned. The others? The guys in my crew, Rick said. Most of them aren't bad people, not really. They're just lost. Harass. They don't have anything else. No family, no jobs, no direction. And after what happened, a few of them are talking about walking away. Starting over. Daniel studied Rick's face, searching for any signs of deception. He saw none. If anything, the man looked almost desperate. So what do you want from me? Daniel asked. I want to fix this, Rick said, his voice earnest. I want to help them find something better. But I don't know how. And you seem to know how to handle yourself. How to lead. I was hoping maybe you could point me in the right direction. For a long moment, Daniel didn't respond. He simply stared at Rick, weighing his words carefully. Part of him wanted to dismiss the man outright, to tell him to deal with his own problems. But another part of him, perhaps the part that still believed in redemption, saw an opportunity. All right, Daniel said finally. Here's the deal. I'll help you. But you need to understand something. This isn't going to be easy. If you're serious about changing, you're going to have to put in the work. And so will they. Rick nodded quickly. Whatever it takes. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself doing something he never thought he'd do, mentoring a group of bikers. He met with Rick and the rest of the crew at a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. The men were skeptical at first, their usual bravado masking their uncertainty. But as Daniel began to speak, their attitudes shifted. This isn't about being soft, Daniel told them during their first meeting. It's about being smart. You want respect? You earn it by doing something that matters. Not by intimidating people or taking what doesn't belong to you. The bikers listened, some more reluctantly than others. Daniel laid out a plan for them to start turning their lives around. It began with small steps, finding legitimate work, mending broken relationships, and taking responsibility for their actions. He didn't sugarcoat anything, making it clear that the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long time, the men began to feel a sense of purpose. Rick, in particular, took Daniel's words to heart. He started reaching out to local businesses, offering to help with odd jobs in exchange for fair pay. Slowly but surely, the crew began to shed their old habits, replacing them with something new. One afternoon, as Daniel was helping Rick repair an old motorcycle, Rick turned to him with a question that had been on his mind. Why are you doing this? Rick asked. You could have just walked away, let us figure it out on our own. But you didn't. Why? Daniel hesitated, his hands stilling on the wrench he was holding. Because someone did the same for me once, he said finally. Back when I was young and angry and didn't know any better. If they hadn't, I don't know where I'd be right now. Rick nodded, his respect for Daniel growing even deeper. Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you stuck around. As the weeks went by, the changes in the crew became more apparent. The men who had once been feared and reviled were now gaining a reputation for their hard work and dependability. Local businesses began to trust them, and the community started to see them in a new light. But not everyone was willing to forgive and forget. One evening, as Daniel and the crew were finishing up a project at the garage, a group of angry townspeople arrived. They were armed with bats and crowbars, their faces filled with anger and fear. We know who you are, one of the men said, his voice trembling with rage. You think you can just waltz back into town and we'll forget everything you've done? Rick stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. We're not those guys anymore, he said. We're trying to make things right. But the townspeople weren't convinced. They advanced on the crew, their weapons raised. Daniel stepped in between the two groups, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Enough, he said, his tone commanding. If you've got a problem, you take it up with me. But you leave them out of it? The crowd hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Daniel took a step closer, his presence almost tangible. They're trying to change, he continued. And if you can't see that, then maybe the problem isn't them, it's you. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Slowly, the townspeople began to lower their weapons, their anger giving way to uncertainty. One by one, they dispersed, leaving the crew to continue their work in peace. By the time the sun set that evening, Rick and the others knew one thing for certain: Daniel Cole wasn't just their mentor. He was their protector. And though the road ahead was still long and uncertain, they were willing to walk it together. Because sometimes, even the most brutal bikers could find redemption. All they needed was someone to show them the way. The weeks passed, and the transformation within the group of bikers became more pronounced. Rick and his crew no longer spent their time intimidating strangers or running scams. Instead, they threw themselves into honest work and community projects. The garage became a hub of activity, repaired motorcycles lined the lot, and neighbors began dropping by with cars, bikes, and even farm equipment that needed fixing. For the first time in years, the group found a sense of purpose. And as their reputation shifted, so did the attitudes of the townspeople. What started as suspicion and resentment slowly softened into acceptance. People began to see the bikers not as threats, but as men who were trying, really trying, to make amends for their past. Daniel remained at the center of it all, guiding the men with his steady hand and no-nonsense demeanor. He wasn't there to coddle them or offer easy solutions. Every lesson he taught was earned through effort, discipline, and self-reflection. And while the bikers grumbled at first, they couldn't deny that Daniel's methods were effective. One day, as Daniel was tightening a bolt on a motorcycle frame, Rick approached him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," Rick said, leaning against the workbench, "I don't think we've ever really thanked you for what you've done here." Daniel glanced up from his work, his hands stilling for a moment. "You don't owe me thanks," he said simply. "You're the ones doing the work." Rick shook his head. "No, it's more than that. We wouldn't have even known where to start if it weren't for you. Hell, I don't think we'd even believe we could change without you showing us it was possible." Daniel set down his wrench, wiping his hands on a rag. "You give me too much credit," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "People don't change because someone tells them to. They change because they want to. You made the choice to be better. I just gave you a push." Rick smiled faintly, but his eyes remained serious. "Still, we wouldn't be here without you." For a moment, Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't used to gratitude, at least, not like this. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Well," he said, "you're welcome." Despite the progress they had made, Daniel knew better than to let his guard down. Change was a fragile thing, and the world had a way of testing even the best intentions. And sure enough, that test came one evening, just as the crew was locking up the garage. A black SUV pulled into the lot, its tinted windows gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Daniel recognized it immediately. It wasn't a local car, and it definitely didn't belong to anyone he trusted. He stepped forward, his posture straight and alert, as the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place in the dusty lot. He was tall and lean, with slicked back hair and a cold, calculating gaze. His smile was thin and humorless as he approached Daniel. "Mr. Cole," the man said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I've been looking for you." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask who the man was or what he wanted. He had seen this type before. Men who operated in the shadows, who pulled strings and manipulated people for their own gain. "You found me," Daniel said evenly. "What do you want?" The man's smile didn't falter. "Oh, it's not about what I want. It's about what you've been doing. Making waves, stirring things up. There are people who don't appreciate that." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." The man chuckled, a low, almost mocking sound. "I'm not selling anything, Mr. Cole. I'm here to offer you a warning. You've stepped on some toes, and not everyone is as forgiving as those bikers you humbled." At the mention of the bikers, Daniel's expression hardened. "If you have a problem with me, say it. But leave them out of it." The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying Daniel. "That's the thing, Mr. Cole. It's not just about you. It's about the example you're setting. You see, some people thrive on fear and control. And when someone like you comes along, showing people they don't have to live in fear, well, that's bad for business." Daniel took a step closer, his tone turning cold. "If you're here to threaten me, you're wasting your time." The man's smile finally faded, replaced by a look of quiet menace. "It's not a threat, Mr. Cole. It's a fact. Keep meddling in things that don't concern you, and there will be consequences. Without another word, the man turned and walked back to his SUV. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off into the night, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The encounter left Daniel unsettled, though he didn't let it show. He knew the type of people the man represented: powerful, ruthless, and unafraid to use whatever means necessary to protect their interests. And while Daniel wasn't one to back down from a fight, he also knew the stakes had just been raised. That night, as the crew gathered around a fire pit behind the garage, Daniel shared what had happened. The bikers listened intently, their earlier camaraderie giving way to a somber mood. "So what do we do?" one of them asked, his voice tinged with fear. "We keep doing what we're doing," Daniel said firmly. "We don't let people like that scare us into submission." Rick nodded, his jaw set. "He's right. We've come too far to turn back now." But Daniel could see the unease in their faces, the lingering doubt. He couldn't blame them. After all, they were up against forces much larger than themselves. And while he didn't say it out loud, he knew this wasn't just their fight. It was his too. Over the next few days, Daniel took extra precautions. He started checking the perimeter of the garage regularly, watching for anything out of place. He taught the crew how to spot signs of surveillance and how to stay vigilant without becoming paranoid. But even as they prepared for the worst, life went on. The garage continued to thrive, and the bikers continued their efforts to rebuild their lives. And slowly but surely, Daniel began to see the fruits of their labor. One evening, as he was locking up, a man approached him, a local shop owner whose car the crew had repaired a few weeks earlier. The man held out a hand, his expression warm. "I just wanted to thank you," the man said. "Not just for fixing my car, but for everything you've done around here. People are starting to notice, and it means a lot." Daniel shook the man's hand, a rare smile touching his lips. "We're just doing what we can." The man nodded. "Well, it's more than enough. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the man walked away, Daniel felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not for himself, but for the men he had helped guide. They had taken his lessons to heart, and now they were making a real difference. But Daniel knew the fight wasn't over. The warning from the man in the SUV still lingered in his mind, a reminder that change often came at a price. And while he was willing to pay it, he also knew he couldn't do it alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lot in shadows, Daniel made a decision. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Hey," he said when the line connected. "It's me. I need a favor." The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment before responding. "What kind of favor?" Daniel glanced at the garage, where Rick and the others were gathered. The kind that requires backup. The favor Daniel called in was not a small one. It wasn't in his nature to reach out for help, but the situation had escalated to the point where he couldn't handle it alone. He had spent years working in isolation, avoiding entanglements, but now he was responsible for a group of people trying to turn their lives around. If anyone was going to come after them, Daniel would make sure they were ready. The person on the other end of the line had listened quietly to Daniel's request, then responded with a simple, "I'll be there." No questions, no hesitation. That was the kind of ally Daniel needed now. The next day, as the sun climbed into the sky, a black Jeep pulled into the garage lot. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his presence commanding even before he said a word. He was dressed in tactical gear, combat boots, a fitted jacket, and cargo pants. His sharp eyes scanned the lot, taking in the scene with a practiced efficiency. Rick and the others froze mid-task, their expressions a mix of awe and uncertainty. The man exuded authority, and it was clear he wasn't someone to be trifled with. "Who's that?" one of the bikers whispered. Daniel stepped out of the garage, wiping grease from his hands. He approached the man, a rare smile crossing his face as they shook hands. "Good to see you, Gray," Daniel said. "You too," Gray replied. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than his fair share of trouble. "You sounded serious on the phone." "I am," Daniel said. "There's a situation here I can't ignore." Gray nodded, glancing at the bikers, who were still staring. "These your guys?" "They are now," Daniel said. They're trying to make things right, but we've run into some resistance. I need your help to make sure they're ready for whatever comes next." Gray smirked. "Training civilians to handle trouble? You're really branching out, Cole." "Don't make me regret calling you," Daniel said, though there was a hint of humor in his tone. Gray wasted no time getting to work. Over the next few days, he put the bikers through a grueling series of drills designed to sharpen their instincts and teach them how to handle themselves under pressure. It wasn't about turning them into soldiers. It was about giving them the tools to stand their ground if things went south. At first, the bikers grumbled. They weren't used to being told what to do, especially not by someone like Gray, whose intensity was almost overwhelming. But as the training progressed, they began to see the value in his methods. Gray taught them how to read a situation, how to de-escalate conflicts before they spiraled out of control, and, when necessary, how to defend themselves. He drilled them on teamwork, showing them that their strength lay in their unity. And while the training was tough, it also gave the bikers a sense of purpose they hadn't felt before. Rick, in particular, took to the training with determination. He pushed himself harder than anyone else, driven by a desire to prove to Daniel, and to himself, that he was capable of change. One evening, after a long day of training, Rick approached Gray as he was packing up his gear. "Thanks for doing this," Rick said. "I know we're not exactly your usual crowd." Gray shrugged. "You're trying to turn your lives around. That's more than most people do. Besides," he added, glancing toward Daniel, who was talking to a few of the other bikers, "if Cole thinks you're worth the effort, that's good enough for me." Rick nodded, his respect for Daniel deepening even further. "He's something else, isn't he?" Gray chuckled. "You have no idea." As the days turned into weeks, the garage began to feel less like a workplace and more like a community. The bikers had grown closer, not just to each other but also to Daniel and Gray. They weren't just fixing bikes and cars anymore. They were building something stronger, a foundation of trust, loyalty, and mutual respect. But even as things seemed to be improving, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the calm wouldn't last. He knew the man in the SUV hadn't made an idle threat. Whoever he represented would be watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Daniel's suspicions were confirmed one night when he received an anonymous text message. The message was short and cryptic, but its meaning was clear. "You should have stayed in the shadows. Now it's too late." Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment, his jaw tightening. He deleted the message and slipped his phone into his pocket. If they thought they could intimidate him, they were sorely mistaken. The attack came 3 days later. It was just past midnight when the first explosion rocked the garage. The bikers, who had been working late on a project, scrambled outside to find a car engulfed in flames. Someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail into the lot, setting the vehicle ablaze. "Get back!" Daniel shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Rick, grab the fire extinguisher." As Rick and a few others worked to put out the fire, Daniel scanned the darkness, his instincts on high alert. He caught a flicker of movement near the edge of the lot, figures darting between the shadows. "They're here," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "Gray, take the left. I'll cover the right." Gray nodded, his expression grim. He pulled a flashlight and a weapon from his gear, moving with the precision of someone who had been in countless firefights. Daniel followed suit, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter as he moved. The attackers didn't reveal themselves immediately, instead resorting to hit-and-run tactics. Rocks and bottles were thrown into the lot, shattering windows and causing more chaos. But Daniel and Gray were ready. They coordinated their movements, flushing out the attackers with calculated precision. Rick and the others, armed with what tools and makeshift weapons they could find, held their ground, defending the garage with surprising determination. The training Gray had given them paid off as they worked together to repel the intruders. By the time the attackers retreated, the lot was a mess of broken glass and scorched earth. But the garage itself was intact, and no one had been seriously injured. Daniel stood in the center of the lot, his chest heaving as he surveyed the aftermath. Gray approached him, his face etched with both relief and concern. "That was a test," Gray said. "They were trying to see how far they could push us." Daniel nodded, his jaw set. "And they found out." Rick joined them, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "What now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. Now we send a message, Daniel said, his tone cold and resolute. They wanted to see what we're made of. Let's show them. In the days that followed, Daniel and Gray worked with the bikers to fortify the garage and prepare for whatever came next. They didn't know who their enemy was, but they were determined to stand their ground. And as word of the attack spread, the community rallied around them, offering support in ways big and small. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. Hope that change was possible, that redemption wasn't just a dream. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. Whoever was behind the attack would be back, and next time, they wouldn't hold back. Daniel glanced at the bikers, who were hard at work reinforcing the garage. They had come a long way from the rough, aimless men he had first met. They were stronger now, not just as individuals but as a team. And as Daniel watched them, he made a silent vow. He would protect them no matter the cost. Because sometimes, the quietest battles were the most important ones. And Daniel Cole wasn't a man who backed down from a fight.